Hello, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we will be discussing Karabakh conflict and international aspects of Karabakh conflict. I think this is a very timely topic because the war is still going on and there is a lot of international attention to this issue. So me, Fariz Ismailzade, and my colleague Nijat Mammadli will be the host of this program and moderators of this program. And our guest is Damjan Krnjevic, the director of publications at ADA University as well as faculty member. This program is filmed actually on the day when UN is celebrating 75th anniversary of its establishment, and this is an important milestone for Karabakh conflict as well because as you know, there were 4 UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions adopted in relations to Karabakh conflict, and they were not implemented all these years. Damjan, first question to you would be, why do you think these resolutions were not implemented? What are the negative consequences of this, and why is it that sometimes we see such weak international law in practice?
Well, it's a complicated question. The short answer to this is that the resolutions were not implemented because the occupying troops refused to leave, and no great power or combination of major powers was willing to enforce the lack of departure of the occupying troops.
But there are some resolutions that get implemented in few days or few hours. How does it work?
There are, but that requires all of the parties directly involved in the conflict to decide to make a political decision to abide by the terms. It's clear that in this case the Armenian occupying troops chose not to do it, and the political pressure that could have been made on them was not made. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that the closest great power to Armenia, or to the South Caucasus in general, was Russia, still is Russia. And Russia in 1994, 93, 95 was not exactly standing on its own 2 feet. Notwithstanding Russia's policy preferences, but just even sort of in the abstract, Russia had no ability at that point to enforce, assuming that it wanted to.
I see.
In a political, obviously, sense and in other senses. And all of the other great powers or major powers at that time simply did not want to exercise their whatever resources they had in terms of putting pressure or whatever to ensure that happened.
Mm-hmm. Damjan, just I wanted to mention here that according to some specialists, international law specialists, one of the reasons why these 4 UN resolutions have not been implemented is that they have not been adopted in accordance to the 7th chapter of UN Charter, but the 6th chapter of UN Charter, which usually are separated by international law specialists. And then I believe there is also political reason why these 4 resolutions have been adopted in accordance to this 6th chapter, not to 7th chapter, right?
Well, the distinction is that one is binding, one is not, right? And binding in the sense that all member states have to abide by this resolution.
Right.
So
they also can deploy.
They can do all sorts of
right.
things. But the most important thing for the purposes of this conversation is the binding nature of the resolution. I read somewhere recently that at least in the context of one of the resolutions, one of the reasons it wasn't adopted according to this binding procedure had to do with the objection of the French permanent representative at the time.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting analogy actually. These days we also see very strong position of France in support of Armenia. So this is 30 years have passed, but not much has changed.
Well, let's not forget that you had a couple of days ago the Security Council met and convened only the 2nd time since 1995 to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh. Mm-hmm. And the first time was a couple of weeks prior to that. So you had the Security Council, a proposal to issue what's called sort of a statement, right, which basically requires all of the members to agree to it. It's a consensus statement. And the statement ended up not being issued because the draft that was proposed by, if I'm not mistaken, the 3 co-chairs of the Minsk process didn't want to refer to the resolution.
Right.
And then you had other members of the Security Council that basically said, no, we're not interested in that. These resolutions should be mentioned. Now, the point is, that when you put that together with the fact that the original resolutions were adopted in a non-binding formula, indicates that that's sort of the space through which Armenia is making the argument that, it's trying to relativize the language and the importance and the political weight and the legal weight of the resolutions.
Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I have to say that during this current phase of the conflict, these resolutions, even though they were non-binding, as Nijat has mentioned, they played a big role in informing the international community that Azerbaijan is actually, trying to liberate its territories, that Armenian troops must withdraw. So they have served as a legal platform or legal basis for diplomatic...
Even political platform.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, look, irrespective of whether they're technically binding on all other member states, they're certainly binding on the member states that are mentioned in the resolution, namely Armenia. So, I mean, let's not, it's important to understand that there is an even more fundamental way of reasserting these, depending on whether you invoke the binding nature on all member states. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, all Security Council resolutions are binding on those that on the parties and the member states that are mentioned in these resolutions, and obviously in this case that has to do with the Armenians, or I should say with Armenia and the Armenian armed forces that occupied Nagorno-Karabakh and that still occupy parts of Nagorno-Karabakh in the 7 surrounding regions, and that there's nothing. However you try to interpret any of these resolutions, that still remains the fundamental impediment to the implementation mm-hmm. of the resolutions, but also to the achievement of some kind of negotiated peace.
Now, one of the interesting things, I believe, is the stances that some Minsk group co-chairs taken in this conflict, despite the fact that they are permanent members of the UN Security Council. They voted and unanimously voted for all these 4 resolutions, but recent statements by, for example, by France president is not very acceptable in this case. So it's a clear taking stance of one side in the conflict, but it should be, I believe, the otherwise. What do you think about it?
Look, if you're a mediator, just forget about the specifics, but just as a general principle of functioning in a civilized manner. If you're a mediator, your job is to mediate, your job is to be neutral, especially in the statements that you make. Your job is to try to bring the two sides together. If you do something else, then you're clearly not, by construction, you're not fulfilling your mandate as a mediator, especially if the mandate is essentially self-imposed, which in this case it was, because a decision was basically made by the co-chairs to become the co-chairs. So it's not like somebody said to them, yeah, you need to do this. They chose to do it. So that's sort of point number 1. Point number 2 is that you can't ignore the fact that you have sort of internal domestic politics playing a role in this. Mm-hmm. France tends to stand on the side of international law in general. I mean, there are exceptions. I would argue that the Kosovo case was an exception to that, and obviously the Nagorno-Karabakh situation is also an exception to that. And when France makes exceptions to this general rule of standing on the side of international law and international norms and all that stuff, which it does both as a member of the European Union, which champions this sort of thing, and so on, when it does this, when France chooses to not stand in that way, to take an anti-international law or a soft approach to international law, the reasons usually have to do with either sort of core national interests, which doesn't seem to be the case in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh.
The influence of Armenian law.
Or something that has to do with domestic politics.
Right. Now that Nijat has brought up the Minsk group and France particularly, I would like to ask a follow-up question about the United States, because US is also co-chairs, and we have seen in this phase of the conflict very interesting attitude from the United States. For several weeks they have been quite silent and not very active, and then there was a meeting in Washington between foreign ministers and Secretary of State, and there's a lot of pressure by Armenian diaspora as well in US on congressmen, on senators to intervene and to do something. So what do you think about the US role in South Caucasus these days? Why do you think US has not been as strategically involved as in the past during 1990s?
Well, I'm not sure that it's fair to say that the United States was genuinely, seriously strategic involved, ever, in this context. I mean, it doesn't mean that they've always been as passive as they've been in recent times. But, you know, the early 1990s were a period, well, from 89 to about 2008, you really had sort of what's understood as having been a unipolar moment.
Right.
Where the Americans could do more or less whatever they wanted, and everybody would go along. Mm-hmm. And this is a complicated issue, let's not get into it now. But
which time frame are we talking about?
So we're more or less from the fall of the Berlin Wall until the economic crisis in the global economic crisis in 2008, which was preceded by the Russian interventions into two parts of Georgia that basically went unopposed. Okay, anyway, this is not, the point is that in the 90s, for sure, you had a unipolar moment situation in which the Americans could act
more
assertively wherever they wanted, and states tended to go along, let's put it that way.
I see.
And that didn't happen in the context of
today.
Nagorno-Karabakh. No, but it didn't happen in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh in the 90s.
Nice. No, but what I meant is that they have been more proactive on pipeline issues, more proactive on security issues, more involved in Caucasus, but not so much these days.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a reflection of the fact that the Trump administration didn't see an American interest in engaging in an active way. Now that, as you noted, has changed in the last couple of weeks, let's say. It would be interesting to think through why. Probably one of the reasons has to do with the pressures that have been exerted through the Armenian diaspora community, which, you know, is not particularly surprising. It makes lots of ethnic communities, lots of interest groups, and so on lobby in the United States. It's a normal part of the situation. But another reason could be the fact that the United States is concerned with the possibility of the network of pipelines being threatened.
Infrastructure.
This certainly the United States tends to take very seriously, especially when American companies are involved.
Okay.
Damien, but recently I've read some commentators saying that one of the reasons why Armenia was interested in escalation of this conflict, actually, it's not actually by Armenia itself, but its leadership, I believe, and in most cases, President Aliyev also mentioned his as a source person in Armenia, and he says that, you know, so the particularly Pashinyan is interested in escalation of this conflict because of he and in his face some Western powers want Russia's involvement in this conflict in order further to punish somehow Russia.
Well, look, I mean, in order for that to be true, two things would have to have happened, and I'm not sure that that's the case. First, somebody clever in the West would have had to formulate a sort of that kind of a strategy to basically pull Pashinyan strings without him knowing it, and then for the Russians to take the bait. I'm not sure that sort of situation reflects, certainly reflects the personalities involved in it. I don't think it reflects geopolitical realities either. I think at the end of the day, for whatever motivated Pashinyan, he certainly upped the rhetoric and tried to change a number of, not just the negotiating format, but his understanding of the relationship between Yerevan and the secessionists in Nagorno-Karabakh. Basically by sort of trying to collapse almost to the point of non-existence, to collapse the distinction between these two. Because remember, it's always important to emphasize this, even Armenia doesn't recognize the secessionist authority.
Right.
But in practice, he has really reduced the distinction being virtually meaningless.
And this has probably created the escalation. I mean,
Well,
Azerbaijan reacted to that statement and to that attitude quite in a nervous way, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, when your defense minister goes out and talks about new wars for new territories, when you know, I mean, just in general, this sort of the upping of the rhetoric is not conducive to engaging, to showing seriousness in the context of wanting to engage in a negotiation. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that you've had a negotiating process that's gone on for 30 years. It essentially hasn't gone anywhere. And in the context of this, you say you want to change the format in a non-constructive way, and then in the midst of what's happening, you say, well, you know, at the end of the day,
Karabakh
is Armenia.
Exactly.
And that's, you know, that's fine. If you want to make that, good for you, but it certainly demonstrates that you're not interested in coming up with a compromise solution.
Win-win solution, yeah.
And there's another thing too. We've heard a lot about people talking about a compromise solution. Well, but the outlines of the compromise solution actually exist. These are the Madrid principles. This is a compromise solution.
Right.
The Madrid principles don't correspond to the maximalist position of Baku, and they don't correspond to the maximalist position of Yerevan.
Exactly.
But what we've heard in the last, I mean, it's a clever political trick, whereby the Armenian leadership is saying, well, we're for compromise, but for us, compromise means moving away from Madrid, right, from the Madrid principles. But that's actually, it doesn't correspond to logic. The compromise is actually the Madrid principles.
Okay, so in this case, the question is that whether this escalation stems from intrinsic interests of Armenia, national interests, or it's just because of change of rhetorics by Armenian new leadership?
Look, you can make a good argument for why Armenia should consider Nagorno-Karabakh and sort of absorbing Nagorno-Karabakh into its political system to be in the national interest of Armenia. You know, it's not a crazy argument. Just like it's not a crazy argument for Armenia to say Ararat should be a part of Armenia. You understand some of the historical logic to this. But that's not the end of the story. The point is it geopolitically feasible? And if it's not, and I don't think it is, then to assert something like this in this particular historical context is a very good example of geopolitical malpractice. Because if you assert as a matter of official policy things that cannot happen without war, that you don't have the capability to fight and win, then how are you advancing your country's interests?
Right. I actually wanted to follow up on this question. Nijat asked it, but we discussed about the US, we discussed about Russia, but European Union as a political space has been quite also passive from conflict resolution efforts. And we see that in current phase of the conflict, Turkey is more active than European countries. Therefore, some analysts are saying that maybe Minsk Group should be changed, that France should be kicked out, and Turkey and Russia should be the co-chairs. What do you think about these developments? Why do you think Europe has been so absent, and why do you think Turkey is so active in this case?
Well, I don't think that the European Union as an evolving entity from, if you look at how it was in the 90s to today, it has never really been a geopolitical player in the South Caucasus. That's the first point. That doesn't appear to be changing rapidly enough to be relevant in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
When you say,
one.
I'm sorry for interrupting, when you say European Union at that period, you include also, I believe, the UK also, right?
Yeah.
Because UK in some cases it was more,
Very, very rarely.
Okay.
The United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken, had only one special representative, whatever the term was, but a senior level point person to engage in this.
Right.
And that happened, I can't remember the exact dates, but it was a while ago. And that person was appointed, had a term that lasted for some period of time, and then a successor was never appointed. So there's no, I mean, the British have a role to play, and they've played it, and they've done it to some extent behind the scenes. But as a general, to come back to the EU aspect, The EU has never been involved in a serious way as an institution in the geopolitics of the South Caucasus. That's, again, point number one. Point number two, you have the fact that that probably the most significant factor, that variable that has changed in this sort of equation with regards to this conflict has been the increase in the Turkish presence.
Right.
The Turkish factor the Turkish variable has become much weightier than it did in the past.
Right.
And I'm not sure that the other most important variable in the equation, the Russians, I'm not sure that they saw this coming. I'm not sure that, they saw it coming, but I'm not sure that they understood how this would change the overall equation.
Mm-hmm.
The Armenians, I'm almost certain, didn't see it coming, certainly didn't understand the implications of it. And I think that Azerbaijan, knowing that the Turkish weight of the variable was going to increase, bided its time in an intelligent enough way to be ready to take advantage of the additional weight of the Turkish variable.
I see.
And that's just an intelligent way to formulate your conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think, how would Iran probably respond to more active participation of Turkey in this political concert?
Yeah, the Iranian issue in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh is very interesting, because the Iranians, for a long time, basically preferred to have a longer border with Armenia than with Azerbaijan. But what's interesting is that at the same time, that has changed over the last couple of weeks.
Right.
All of a sudden, the Iranian position, which has never really changed in a fundamental way, Iran has always talked about territorial integrity and all these things, but all of a sudden, statements made from the very top down to the advisory level the tone has changed, and the emphasis has changed. So the position hasn't changed, but the way of understanding the situation has changed. And my guess is that that's based on two things. It's based on the fact that that the ethnic Azerbaijanis who live in Iran have their weight in the domestic equation of Iranian politics has gotten heavier. They've gotten to be more influential, more vocal. On the one hand, and on the other hand, Iran likes to pick a winner.
Mm.
When Iran has a non-ideological approach to an issue, which seems to have been the case in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh and the South Caucasus generally. So when that's the case, then
They side with the winner.
they tend to try to side with the winner.
And let's not forget that the border, for the first time, is now fully controlled by Azerbaijani law enforcement bodies, which has been for 30 years under occupation. That's might be another reason why Iranians now are showing more interest.
Well, yeah, I think that was part of what I meant in the context of the fact that they preferred a longer border with Armenia when you put into account the occupied territories. But since, the Iranians are very sophisticated observers of events in this part of the world, and they presumably saw this coming. And so to oppose it when there's nothing you can do doesn't make any sense. So they were happy to, they took advantage of the opportunity, and good for them. That's, probably what I would have done.
Now I would like to ask a question which is probably $1 million question in everybody's mind. The balance of power which existed for 30 years is no longer the same balance of power. The advancing Azerbaijani troops have broken the ceasefire line, the defense lines of Armenia, and have liberated several regions. So obviously the balance of power has changed. The question is, how will that be reflected now in the peace process, negotiation process, whether the changed balance, the changed equilibrium will bring more opportunities for peace and breakthrough, or do you think we will continue having this very long and nasty conflict? What do you think about that?
I think that it really is a $64,000 question. But I think the answer has to do, you have to look at, to get to this answer, you have to look at two things. You're talking about a military balance of power on the one hand, which you discussed, but you've also we've also talked earlier in this conversation about the political balance of power, the geopolitical balance of power in the region that has changed. And so when you put these two things together, and the fact that both Yerevan and Baku tend to not, at least rhetorically, tend to not emphasize the willingness to really come back and sit at the negotiating table without preconditions and all this sort of thing. Given the victories, the battlefield victories, and the Armenian response to that, which is to basically say, we're in it to win or to lose, that's it. It seems to me to be very difficult to expect that a preference for a negotiated solution is something that we're going to see in the short term.
Right. Unless imposed by big powers.
Well, but again, how do you impose? I mean, fine, that's true, of course, but the question is, how do you impose it?
Mm-hmm.
Who is going to be doing the imposing, and what are going to be the consequences of not abiding by that imposition?
Right.
Right? So what could those be? They could be sanctions. Nobody seems to be interested in sanctioning Armenia or Azerbaijan. At least the coalition that you need to come up with in the Security Council for something like that to happen, or in the EU or wherever, it's unlikely to happen. Military intervention, somehow going in the middle of a war zone and establishing a new line of contact, highly unlikely that that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's going to be political pressure, of course. Yeah. But at the end of the day, for political pressure to be credible, it has to be backed up by something other than political pressure. And I just don't see right now a constellation of factors that would lead to that credibility being put on the table.
So you mean that these escalations? So I'm coming to the part that when we will start, and at least the region will start living peaceful conditions, and how would our Armenian and Azerbaijanis mostly will live in peace. So do you see any possibility that in the near future both sides at least will come to a position that we will be able to discuss the modalities of peaceful coexistence?
I think that a discussion on those modalities is going to... No, I think it's important to put into context, to talk about the context in which a discussion of those modalities would take place.
Right.
So they're going to take place, sort of in the abstract, they take place in one of two ways: at the negotiating table or on the basis of a military victory. If they take place on the basis of a military victory, the likelihood of that conversation taking place between equal parties is obviously minimal. Mm-hmm. So if I were Armenia, I would do everything possible to come up with a way to sue for peace. Because then you can extract concessions at the negotiating table for precisely what you're talking about, the modalities of governance or self-governance or whatever it is in the liberated territories. If you lose this territory on the battlefield, then you have no leverage.
Right.
But the thing that I think we come back to the fundamental disconnect, and that is that Armenia is not willing to accept that it needs to withdraw its troops. Or it's willing to accept that if immediately there's some kind of a self-determination process. The Azerbaijani president has basically dismissed the likelihood of there being a referendum in Nagorno-Karabakh if it's not done at the negotiating table.
Right.
Which makes complete sense. If you liberate the territories completely on the battlefield, then all of a sudden you have no reason to abide by the terms of the Madrid principles because the other side hasn't abided by them either.
Although for several years Azerbaijan did offer referendum and local self-governance opportunities in the form of autonomy, even the highest level of autonomy, but Armenia rejected those.
You know, I come from the Western Balkans, and I've thought through, there's a parallel that for me is very indicative. Mm-hmm. Republika Srpska Krajina was a breakaway region of Croatia. Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia in 1991. Around that time, the majority Serbian areas of Croatia seceded from Croatia. And this went on they held this territory until 1995. Nobody recognized them, not even Serbia, and so on. And there was a very forward-looking peace initiative that was made in January of that year called the Z4 plan that was put forward by international mediators, including Russians, Americans, and so on. The terms of this plan were incredibly generous to the Serbian community in Croatia.
To give autonomy.
Basically complete. The formulation at the time was more than autonomy, less than independence. And with great hesitation, Zagreb was smart enough to accept this plan, at least as the basis for negotiations. And unfortunately, the leadership of Republika Srpska Krajina did not accept the plan. They even refused to physically get a copy of the plan. And it became absolutely clear after that sooner or later, with negotiations having been rejected, with a compromise solution that was genuinely generous to the Serbian community having been rejected, that the non-negotiated option would then be exercised by Croatia. It was just a question of when, how, and so on.
Interesting analogy.
And so, you have this situation where, for a long time, the Armenians refused to accept the fact that they needed to engage in a process that involved them withdrawing militarily. And now they're crying because they're running around trying to get the CSTO to get involved, or they even tried to get NATO to get involved. They're running around lamenting the fact that a military option has been exercised. Today, we could be in a situation in which the opportunity has passed. And this is unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you, Damjan. That was an excellent comparison between, I believe, Republika Srpska and
Republika Srpska Krajina.
Republika Srpska Krajina. Okay, that was a and between and Nagorno-Karabakh case. I would like to thank you for your excellent intervention and thoughts on all these things. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you both for having invited me.
Thank you, and follow our program for more discussions, and watch us on YouTube.